So dear guests of this broadcast, dear faculty, dear students who've joined us, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the distinguished historian and acclaimed author who admittedly has influenced interpretations of the Cold War more than any other historian, Professor John Lewis Gaddis. Born in Texas, Professor Gaddis received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Texas. His academic career started at Indiana University Southeast and then continued at Ohio University, where in 1987 he founded and directed Contemporary History Institute. Before becoming professor of military and naval history at Yale University in 1997, Professor Gaddis was a visiting professor of strategy at the Naval War College, the Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History at Oxford. He also taught at Princeton University and the University of Helsinki. In 1991, Professor Gaddis helped to establish Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, which supports the full and prompt release of historical materials by governments on all sides of the Cold War, seeking to integrate new sources, materials, and perspectives. In 1991, he served as president for the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. In the 2001-2002 academic year, Professor Gaddis was the George Eastman Professor at Oxford, thus becoming the second scholar to have the honor of being both Eastman and Harmsworth Professor at Oxford University. Professor Gaddis has published numerous books and received nearly 10 awards for his academic research and influence, including the National Humanities Medal. I, for one, as a student of this university, was particularly influenced by his The Long Peace, Inquiries into the History of the Cold War, published in 1987, a profound study that examines the history of US-Soviet relations, explaining why there has been no warfare between the two superpowers. 2018 saw the publication of his On Grand Strategy, a masterclass in strategic thinking based on the legendary seminar that he has co-taught at Yale for decades. Professor Gaddis is also the official biographer of the seminal 20th century American statesman, diplomat, and historian George Kennan. And George Kennan's biography, which was called John Kennan, An American Life, won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for biography. Today, we are lucky to have a unique chance to listen to and discuss the uses of history with the Dean of the Cold War Historians, as the New York Times once called him, with Professor John Lewis Gaddis. Please join me in thanking Professor Gaddis for agreeing to partake in this seminar, in welcoming him to MGIMO. In case you didn't know, there is a clapping hands reaction button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to give him a round of applause. And now I would like to turn this over to Dr. Mikhail Troitsky, the director of the MGIMO School of Government and International Relations, to moderate this discussion. Mikhail, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baikov, and I'll keep a very low profile here. I just would like to turn it over without further ado to Professor Gaddis for his introductory remarks. And I'll just say that I thoroughly enjoyed reading the chapter that he circulated from on strategy. So the floor is yours, Professor Gaddis.
Thank you, Professor Troitsky, Professor Baikov, and everyone else who has joined us today from wherever you are by way of Zoom, our new technology. I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk about that word Zoom and to talk about its different contexts. We think of it today primarily as a vehicle for communication of the kind we are using. But of course, in English, it has a different meaning. It can mean shifting from things that are very large to things that are very small and back again. What happens when you attach a zoom lens, for example, to a camera, or what happens when you use Google Earth to zoom in and to zoom out. And as I've thought about this, and this was long before Zoom computer technology developed, it did seem to me that this comes in some strange way fairly close to what historians do. I think they zoom in to focus on detail, but they also have a habit of zooming out to try to look at the larger picture. And certainly my own career reflects that for sure. As Andrea said, for many years, I worked on the Cold War, which was kind of a medium level zoom, a relationship between two great powers. and the involvement of other powers, but began to zoom out to think about the connections to the international system, and then began to zoom out to think even more about grand strategy. And this latest book on grand strategy actually says nothing about the Cold War, but it does go all the way back to the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC and comes forward through World War II. I think I just wanted to see if I could write a book that didn't say anything about the Cold War. And I had a good deal of fun doing that, for sure. My latest project is also a Zoom project, but it involves zooming in very close detail on a micro topic. And the micro topic is actually the small town in South Texas that I grew up in the mid-20th century, which in the late 19th century had the reputation of being the most violent town in all of Texas. The records, the legends, all of this are quite striking. It's as if you take all the Western movies and lump them together. And that was the history of Cotulla, my hometown. And we had always been told about this as kids, but nobody ever gave us the details on this. And so what I've been doing is trying to reconstruct those details, not from local newspapers, because that didn't work very well. The newspaper editors kept getting shot, but rather from other newspapers around the state, which allow a kind of triangulation or multi-angulation as to what was happening in this notorious little town. And I have no idea what I'm going to do with this, but it's fun to work on. And I think of micro zooming, just as the last book was, I guess, a demonstration of macro zooming, which circles around to something I do in teaching my first year students, my freshmen, who are 18 years old when they come to Yale. I do a seminar for them for 18 first year students, and they read the predictable things on historical methodology. But I also, on top of that, have them read all 1,200 pages of War and Peace, which of course they've never read before. So this is new to them. It creates a reading load which is double that of normal Yale seminars. But because they're first years, they don't know any better. And so they just say, yes, of course, whatever you say, professor. And then they get hooked on Tolstoy, predictably, as they get into it. And they get fascinated with the great characters. They fall in love with Natasha. They respect Prince Andrei. They all see themselves as Pierre stumbling through unpredictable situations. But they also get a sense of zooming in and zooming out in a very dramatic way, because, of course, the theme of War and Peace is Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. But what's characteristic, what's distinctive, what's so impressive about Tolstoy is his ability to move from the level of Napoleon and Alexander I down to the level of the generals, down to the level of the soldiers who were fighting in the Battle of Borodino, down to the terrain, down to how the horses must have felt, down to what the battle sounded like, and so on, and then back out again to the larger picture. And Tolstoy, as an author of historical fiction, it seems to me, is demonstrating something that historians do without being fully conscious of it, which is to shift scale. We talk about time and we talk about space, but we rarely talk about the third dimension of history, which I think is scale. The ability to move from big things to small things and back again. But of course, life does this, as Tolstoy so beautifully points out. And I don't see why history should not try to find ways to deal with this as well. The problem, of course, is that if you zoom out for the larger picture, you are to some extent going to have to use your imagination, because the archives, our traditional source, will not really take that broad view. So we have to try to imagine what this looks like from a larger perspective. But if you zoom in on micro detail, the archives are not going to pick that up either. So the archives limit us to a certain level of detail. And that's where we normally function. But it seems to me if one is to get at what really caused things to happen, one needs to think not only about that larger picture, the international system or whatever that might be, but also to the micro detail. And I'm fascinated with how Tolstoy does this. I think about the very costly but relatively indecisive Battle of Borodino in September 1812, as compared to the relatively little known and much smaller Battle of Tarantino in October of 1812, after Moscow was captured by the French, in which the Russians, for the first time, achieved a victory. And Tolstoy captures this by imagining two Cossacks who are hungry and need lunch, and they see a hare jumping through the forest, and they follow the hare over a hill, and they see the entire French army there. And they go back to Kutuzov and say, we should attack. And Kutuzov doubtfully authorizes the attack, and it produces the victory, which comes just at the psychological moment, the psychological hinge point, at which the soldiers in the French army had begun to doubt the wisdom of their great leader and are beginning to see snowflakes falling. So it's this little tilt, Tolstoy says, that turns history and turns the French invasion into a complete panic. Now, was there really a hare there? Was there really, were there really hungry Cossacks chasing it? There's no way to know this, but it could have been this way for sure. If not this hare, it could have been other things like that, micro events, because history sometimes pivots on micro events. You can get to a point of criticality where just one tiny variable, one tiny variation will push the system into a completely different configuration. Think about sand piles, the physics experiment with sand piles, which gradually drops grains of sand on a sand pile, and thousands of grains of sand can drop, and the sand pile is still there. But one more grain of sand causes the whole thing to collapse. And how do we know which grain of sand that's going to be? There's no way we can know this. It's beyond our capacity to measure. But Tolstoy points out that this is what happens in life. And the whole last 30 pages of War and Peace actually are a very advanced discussion of what physicists would now say is criticality, the sensitive dependence on initial conditions, the way one tiny small act somewhere, even an accident somewhere, can have huge consequences. So I was thinking about this in preparing this talk today. I was thinking about the fact that Tony and I have been sequestered in our house in New Haven now for about 2.5 months. I was looking at myself in the mirror and I was deciding that I badly need a haircut and I can't get out and get one. So why is it that I need a haircut right now? Well, Tolstoy has the answer, it seems to me. Tolstoy, I think, would say that it all goes back to some bat in China that had the misfortune to be captured and butchered in a Wuhan wet market. And somebody else ate the bat. And then from this, the situation arose that explains the situation the whole world is in right now. Tolstoy would have known perfectly well what to do with the coronavirus, it seems to me. And this is why I find him fascinating to teach to my freshmen, because it shows so well what it is that historians do without thinking about it. And sometimes only a novelist really can do this. And so this circles back around to the perpetual debate about whether history is a science or an art, and which is the more faithful replication, the more faithful representation of human affairs. And I think it shows the complete artificiality of that distinction, because there are physical and natural sciences that have developed the capability to shift scale dramatically. But even they would acknowledge there are some things that are below our capacity to measure. And when a critical, and that's why you can never predict when an earthquake, for example, is going to come, or a stock market is going to crash, or something like this. But Tolstoy understands this, and as a novelist can represent it. And this last section of War and Peace, which nobody ever reads, where Tolstoy talks about infinitesimals, is an anticipation of this 100 years before the physics actually began to be developed. So that's what I've been thinking about lately, and I think it does circle around to a somewhat different way of looking at history, which privileges the humanities for sure, which privileges the imagination, but also constitutes good science. And I think that's where history lodges. I think I'll stop with that and see if we have questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gaddis, for this fascinating introduction. So, yeah, basically, criticality in history, chance, probability, occurrence. This is the topic of our seminar, and I see the first hand was raised by Professor Kurila. So let me just give St. Petersburg the chance to speak first, and then please raise your hands, and I'll be sure to register your willingness to talk. Yes, please, Ivan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you very much, Professor Gaddis. You know, I teach political scientists about what history is, and I use your book, The Landscape of History, you know, and we spend the whole seminar discussing what is independent variable from the point of view of historian, which is, you know, something very strange. And we, you know, and your book is very stimulating. I give political scientist students to a little of understanding how different social science from history is, and it's very helpful. Thank you very much for the book.
I wrote that book in the hopes of getting into a dialogue with political scientists. This landscape was written in the year 2000. And I hoped that I would bridge the gap between history and political science, and that we could narrow this silo, this divide, you know, that separates us. However, all my political scientist friends stopped talking to me when that book came out. And I've been shunned by the political science community because I've said there is no such thing as an independent variable, and that really messes up their theories. So it did not go well.
Yeah, thank you. I also always feel myself between political scientists and historians, so I very well understand what your concerns here. But I actually have another question.
Sure.
And this question is about your early book, where you zoomed out very much your book about Russia, USSR, and United States. This, you know, book about the whole 200 years of Russian-American relations. And it was published in 1978, I think, and it was the second edition came out in 1990.
Correct.
And my question would be, if you would change anything, just one big thing in that book, if you rewrite it or, you know, amend it right now, what one big thing we would write differently now, looking back from 2020? Thank you.
I think it's dangerous to try to do this kind of thing because there are always things that you would do differently. And to go back over your old books and try to figure out how you could rewrite them, I think is psychologically demoralizing. And I find it very difficult to do. I've done a couple of updates of books. That was one of them, but I find it hard to do. The most I could do actually was to add a new chapter, I think, at the end of that. And it was the same with strategies of containment. But this idea of just constantly revising your own book strikes me as a little bit like having a very malleable political ideology, which you modify according to circumstances along the way. And I don't think that's really true to history in the first place. So I think that book has to be seen in the context of the times in which it was written. And I like to be seen as just having moved on from my youthful foolishnesses.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gaddis. And I see another hand raised, Dr. Shipkova from MGIMO. You can unmute and talk, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gaddis, for your fascinating introduction. And my question might seem a bit naive or simple to the audience, which is much more experienced than me. And that is why I cannot help but seize this opportunity to ask this question, because I'm very much concerned about it. So just a brief introduction. Not so long ago, I started teaching history in international groups. So the groups where people come from abroad, the majority of students come from abroad in these groups. And what I suddenly came to realize is that the way my students perceive the information, the material which I give to them and the material which they read, depends so much on where they are from. And when we discussed World War II, for instance, my guys literally turned into representatives of their national governments of that time. So the guy from France tried to explain why France was forced to collaborate with Nazi Germany, and the girl from Russia, she was struck by the number of people who died in China, because she had previously thought that only the Soviets perished in this war. And the guy from Latvia insisted that we spoke more about the Soviet policy in Baltic states on the verge of World War II. So all of them had their own interpretations of the main events of World War II, and these interpretations went far beyond the cold, hard facts. So as you might have guessed, my question is, how can we teach history in an unbiased way? How can we reconcile all these interpretations? Maybe you could share your experience. Thank you so much.
I don't think we can teach history from an unbiased perspective. I don't think that there is a single objective standard for history beyond just a few basic obvious facts, such as maybe time passes, or such as aspirations always exceed capabilities. But beyond that, it seems to me that history is so complex and so variable, and we understand even now so little of it, sometimes only the surface of events that were taking place, that I think objectivity is an illusion in history. I just don't think you can get there. What we can do is to do the best we can, but with the understanding that this has to be a provisional judgment, which is subject to revision, which is subject to new information that may come forward. It may be new archival sources that come forward. So that was a big concern for many of us in Cold War history in the late 1980s and certainly in the 1990s. And I wrote an entire book, We Now Know, in 1997, which was reconsidering what I had said in earlier books about the Cold War, based on the new documents that were coming out of the Wilson Center project. So we can do that. But at the same time, I would be the first to say that there's a lot that we now know in 1997 did not pick up. And scholars of the Cold War today, particularly those who are dealing with the Third World, are finding completely new dimensions to the Cold War. So I think we simply have to say this is what makes history interesting, is that it's never completely stable. And I think we need to teach our students not to expect that kind of stability. But it seems to me that's really just a reflection of life, because who among us, just in everyday life, is unbiased? I don't think anybody really is. I think we all have our respective concerns, prejudices, outlooks, and whatnot. And to expect somehow a discipline like history to achieve this standard, I think, is an illusion. So the question comes up then, always, particularly from political scientists, well, how do you verify anything? How do you know when you've got it right? And I think the answer is simply, you don't, but it is possible to get a consensus. And the consensus is what drives verification, at least in history. I think it's very much the same in the sciences, the hard sciences particularly, physics, chemistry, paleontology, are not yet, have not yet really reached definitive conclusions on anything. New evidence causes reconsiderations of what we know. And so science operates, medicine operates by simply commanding the largest consensus possible at the time, but with the understanding that new sources of information, as in the coronavirus situation, new formula for vaccines, can change very rapidly and change what we know. So I think we just have to accept that. And frankly, I'm happy to do it because it seems to me it makes life much more interesting.
Thank you, and I recognize Professor Lipkin. I just wanted to, make a very short follow-up. So, Professor Gaddis, do you distinguish between kind of benign and malign sort of contributions to history, to this consensus you have been talking about? So it's one thing if a document pops up and and you can reinterpret some major historical event, and it's different. It's a different thing if that consensus is kind of shifted artificially or used for political purposes to rally around the flag or to kind of advance foreign policy agendas and so forth. So have you been able to distinguish between these two kind of attempts to change the consensus in your career as a historian, or you just don't care about politics?
No, it's of course a problem, and the abuse of history has led to some of the greatest atrocities in history, it seems to me. So I think we have to be able to discuss these things candidly. This is why I think that trying to cover up history, embarrassing history, horrible history, is a really bad idea. I think we have to confront history in this way. And it seems to me that anyone who fails to confront history bluntly, who seeks to conceal critical elements of what happened in the past, actually, is reflecting a great deal of psychological insecurity on their part, as if they are running a regime which is on the verge of collapse or something like that. It's an indication of nervousness, it seems to me. And I will name no names here, but I do see an increasing trend to try to wipe whole areas of history out of consciousness. I will name one name. It does seem to me that China is particularly headed in that direction at this moment, because the Great Cultural Revolution cannot be discussed anymore. The Great Leap Famine cannot be discussed anymore. We are told that there are all kinds of things that cannot be discussed anymore. Is this a sign of self-confidence on the part of the Chinese government? I think not at all. And so I think we need to be able to say that. We need to be able to be blunt about that. Sometimes we have to be courageous to do that. But sooner or later it will come out, and sooner or later these things will be known. They aren't forgotten.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Lipkin.
Excuse me, may I ask a question? This is Professor Naumkin. I don't know whether you can hear me or not.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mikhail.
Sure, absolutely. I guess Dr. Lipkin was the next in line,
Okay.
but you can go ahead, please, Vitaly Vyacheslaevich Naumkin, Russia's
after Dr. Lipkin.
Okay, absolutely,
Sure.
absolutely. I acknowledge.
I'm number 2 after him.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Gaddis. It's a pleasure to see you, and may I pass the best wish from academician Alexander Chubaryan. I am his yes, colleague also. And what I wanted to say, I wanted just to say a few provocative things. Maybe you will agree, maybe not. But following your counterfactual approach and trying to pose Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy into our times, I doubt, and I think that maybe if you write his great novel, The War and Peace, nowadays as a text, very few will notion him, and he probably will not become so authoritative author as he did over all things what happened in the 20th century and after reading by several generations after. If he become a producer, if he staged his novels, if he become, I don't know, someone from the show business, I think he will be recognized very quickly. And what I'm talking about, it's about the image of history. The image of history shapes, the language of history shapes. And when also we're working with the best students, for instance, at MGIMO, and we're trying, and I'm trying to give them various pieces, various memoirs, trying to reconstruct the image and the spirit of the epoch, for instance, of France, using the prototypes of the Alexandre Dumas heroes, I see that they don't know the text. They don't read the Three Musketeers, and all what they have in their head is the image from Hollywood, from Russian cinema, from some, I don't know, games, computer games, etc. But it's reality we are dealing now, and that's a problem even for some generations, some generation gap when we're talking with new students about what happened before. So do you agree that perhaps this reflection of history, of course, shapes from the epoch of the Tolstoy to the nowadays, and whether historians of nowadays should make some change and either continue work as Leo Tolstoy did or invent something new? What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting problem. I think the first time that I tried to use Tolstoy with my freshmen, my first years, I told them on the first day of class we would be reading the world's greatest novel. And one of my students piped up and he said, "No, it's not." And I said, "Well, what is?" And he said, "Harry Potter." So this indicates something about the level of familiarity with the classics on the part of young people today, which is one part of what you were talking about. And I think one concern, or one thing that I am trying to do with my freshmen is simply get them interested in reading historical fiction. And Tolstoy is an excellent way to do it. At the same time, it is still fiction, and they have to understand this. And if they want a complete historical narrative of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, they should go to Andrew Roberts. They should go to Dominic Levin, for example, who have written big books on this. But the point is, they are not automatically going to go to those books, at least not yet. They have to be hooked. They have to be intrigued. They have to become curious about this in the first place. And that's where Tolstoy is so wonderfully helpful. So even though, of course, he's inaccurate in several different ways, of course, he dramatizes in several different ways, he still is basically right in terms of the larger picture, that Napoleon was a great hedgehog who believed he could overrun everything and nothing could stand in the way. And Kutuzov was wise enough just to doze off and sleep and wait until something happened that would undercut the morale of Napoleon's army. And why didn't Napoleon himself think of this? Well, that's a really good question. It shows a principle that I tried to discuss in the Grand Strategy book, which comes from some of the work of Isaiah Berlin on foxes and hedgehogs, and Phil Tetlock's work on the differences between foxes and hedgehogs. But the pattern is this, that hedgehogs, the people who have one big idea, tend to rise in prominence and influence because they're very glib, because they're very charismatic, all of this. And foxes sometimes give too many explanations, and they dither, and they take too long, and they're boring, and all of this. But in the process of rising, hedgehogs tend to lose touch with the ground. They tend to abandon common sense. And this book, Tolstoy on War and Peace, is one of the great books, one of the greatest books ever written, about the loss of common sense at high altitudes. And this is why I say in the book, common sense is like oxygen. It gets thinner the higher the higher you go. Kutuzov at a lower level retained his common sense, and Tolstoy shows how that happened very well. And I think that's perfectly consistent with the historical record, even as we quibble about the particular details. So that's my answer, that sometimes the way into history is through those authors who are able to dramatize or even to romanticize history as a way of getting young people interested in it.
Thank you. And Professor Naumkin is next.
Thank you very much. No, my question is related to causation.
Yes.
I'm recollecting your story of poor Mr. Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also recollecting some other things, including this awful bat in China.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is about causation at the micro level. I'm also remembering, because my narrow specialty is the Middle East, I'm recollecting what had been not known to public on the crisis in 1958, before the Cuban crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So when there was a revolution in Iraq, and the United States was thinking about some intervention.
Yes.
And at night, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party was discussing the things very important, what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And Khrushchev was in favor of sending a warning that there'll be a very firm response, military response from Moscow. And Marshal Voroshilov, who had a reputation of being not very bright, but he was sober enough to say, look, guys, if you send such a warning, you'll say A, then you'll have to say B if there still is going to be an invasion, and there'll be a nuclear war because of Iraq. So let's not do that. And there was a debate, which is, for me, it was a surprise when I knew about it after many years, because of Fursenko Naftali book, you know it perfectly well, based on new archives. And Khrushchev decided, he convinced the members of the Politburo to send a warning. And there was no invasion. There was a face-saving, airborne units sent to Jordan from Britain and from the United States to Lebanon. But there was not nuclear war. And then Khrushchev said, look, these guys, they understand only force. And it was a reason why he went to the Cuban crisis later on in '62, based on this very experience. So it was clear that this was, at this micro level, there was some cause that made all this fuss about this Cuban crisis. Very dangerous. And another example of Lieutenant Colonel Petrov in '83, who, because of this fake, warning about the missile attack from the United States, he, as people say, he saved the world of a nuclear war. So the question is, to what extent certain factors are of relevance in preventing things or causing things? I can name three factors. One is human agency. To what extent it's important. Second is a new knowledge. So we acquired new knowledge from these archives by Fursenko and Naftali, and we learned certain lessons from that. And number three, it's level of predictability. We know that the Middle East is highly unpredictable. To what extent this level of predictability is of relevance in analyzing prediction and causation and learning lessons. Thank you.
Well, I think you can always make this argument, and in tracing causation of great events, you can trace back to even sometimes very ridiculous things, you know. So I played around in Landscape of History with how to explain the causes of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And I said, if the Japanese had not had carriers to launch their planes, there would have been no attack. If they'd had no planes, there would have been no attack. If they'd had no Navy, there would have been no carriers. If they'd had if geology had not pushed up the Japanese islands from the floor of the Pacific, none of this would have happened. All of those things are true. But there's a difference between remote causation and near or proximate causation. And as we get closer to the events, it seems to me that the proximal cause is likely to be the most important one, even though one can never totally dismiss all the other causes. Mark Bloch, the great medieval historian, wrote about this. Tolstoy, I think, understands this as well. And when he's talking about infinitesimals at the end of War and Peace, the problem with infinitesimals is that there are an infinite number of them and they go back indefinitely. So you can never know which one is the determining one. It's beyond our capacity to measure certain things. Just as fundamental particles in physics are increasingly getting so complex that we cannot measure these things. Just as predicting the weather is beyond our capacity to measure these things. Many things are, and history is clearly one of them. So I think we just have to accept that causal chains are there. They are important. They are certainly worth tracing. But at the same time, we have to maintain common sense. We have to understand that if we, as a historian, someone as a historian is writing about the attack on Pearl Harbor and traces it all the way back to the rise of the Japanese islands out of the Pacific Ocean by volcanic action, this would be considered ludicrous. And so there's an unstated cutoff point, it seems to me, which everybody must be the judge of him or herself. But we all implicitly accept the legitimacy of that cutoff point in assessing causation. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next is Professor Baranovsky, and I apologize for failing to introduce our guest. So Professor Baranovsky is a senior director at the Primakov Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences, the leading Russian think tank studying, academically and comprehensively international politics. And let me just, we are doing well on time. And let me just remind you that that we would like every speaker to limit their remarks to just maybe 3 minutes, if at all possible, because I think I see people queuing up to ask their questions. Vladimir Georgievich, the floor is yours.
Yes, Mikhail, thank you for the introduction. I would make a considerably shorter introduction. I am both historian and a political scientist, but I'm more political scientist than historian. I teach things related to international relations, but basically contemporary international relations. But in my teaching, I cannot avoid using history, mentioning history, and actually all the time I refer to history, to historical examples, to historical experience, and I think that this is absolutely essential when trying to understand the political events, the political logic, the political dynamics, and in this respect, I'm very interested in what you are writing and what you have said today. May I come back to one? Well, actually, I have 2 points. One is about your point about objectivity objectivity is illusion. I think it's a very, very interesting statement. I can understand the logic of the statement, and you have already explained, you provided a number of arguments in support of the statement. But this, on the other hand, recall me one personality from our contemporary history, not recent history. We used to have a minister of culture who pretended to be a historian and who actually insisted on the fact that there is no objective truth in history, in remote history, in recent history, and what is a real truth, what is really objectively important in history, it is the usefulness of some actions, the usefulness of some activities, the usefulness of some acts, if it is useful to what, I don't know, to a political party, to some political ideas, then this is something which should be considered as a truth. And I'm afraid that this in a sense coincides with your idea about objectivity, which is illusion. So I would appreciate very much your clarifications about this thesis. And my second point about what was just discussed right now about causation. It's a big issue. It's a big issue, and I think that there is one problem. We do not know very much about history, and my question would be, what do you believe? More we know about history, more we know about historical events, more we are able to understand the situation, the logic, the circumstances, or on the contrary, the situation could be perceived as becoming more chaotic and less clear. Vitaly Naumkin mentioned the issue of the issue which was related somehow to Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me recall that Cuban Missile Crisis is absolutely exceptional case, because this is something on which there are a lot of publication, a lot of memories, a lot of information. We know almost everything about Cuban Missile Crisis. We know at what point, at what time, who said what, and what actions were taken by the American political leaders and by the Soviet political leaders. But this is a very exceptional thing. Here we could actually re-establish the causal logic of events, but not very often in many other cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just come back on the question of objectivity and objectivity as an illusion, and how that relates to the issue of utility, that is, how it relates to how you would use the information in the first place. And I find it useful in dealing with my students about this to use the analogy of cartography, to use the analogy of map making. Because if you think about a map, there is no perfect scale for a map. A map can be large scale, a map can be very small scale, micro scale. They are still considered to be useful. It depends on why you're making the map in the first place. But at the same time, just because there is no standard for objectivity or standard for making maps for the scale of a map, no proper standard, it does not mean that the object being mapped is not there. This is the famous coastline of Britain problem in mathematics. Nobody can say how long the coastline of Britain is because it's irregular, and it depends on what unit of measurement you apply in measuring it. But of course, nobody would say that Britain is not there. Nobody would try to sail a supertanker through it just because you cannot find the ideal accurate scale for a map. So cartography is an interesting analogy to use, I think, in thinking about history. And this really had to do with the subtitle of my book, Landscape, when I was talking about how historians map the past. This was the connection that I had in mind.
Okay, so let me recognize Professor Pichatnov, and Professor Martynov. So Professor Pechatnov is Russia's top historian of the Cold War and the professor at MGIMO. So the floor is yours, Vladimir Olegovich.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. John, getting back to this objectivity problem, I think when you say that objectivity is an illusion, that sounds a bit static, too static and pessimistic to me. I understand that we cannot obtain the historical truth in its entirety. We cannot be entirely objective, or entirely unbiased. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive, that we shouldn't try to be as objective as we can.
Yes.
Which implies that we should be able to overcome our own biases to the extent possible, to reconsider the old views in the light of new evidence, right? And to grow mentally over the lifetime and become a wiser and a more clear-sighted person. So I think there is still something in this approximation you wrote about, approximation, which is the pursuit of history as approximation of getting closer to the objectivity and to the truth in so-called. I think there is a progression there, and it should be for all of us in the field if we are honest enough and not lazy in our pursuits. And also, I would just, for the sake of the audience, mention that John is one of the rare persons in the field who can both zoom out and zoom in. He started as a very meticulous archival scholar who never missed an interesting document, and then he became, as he was getting older, he was becoming more generalistic in his approach, and now he's going back to zooming in his local town. That's an interesting trajectory. But I would be interested in this, John. Do you really believe in this kind of progress, in our ability to grow and to get closer to what is objective and truthful in history?
Yes, of course I do, Vladimir. And this is why the cartography analogy, I think, comes through. One of the things I do with my first year seminar, on the very first day of class, I set up a projector and a computer, and we do Google Earth. And so I have the view of the entire globe up, and then I ask them to tell us, each of us individually, where they're from. And so they zoom in on their home country, on their hometown, on their house, their high school, all of this, and then out again. And it's a fascinating exercise, but it makes this point, precisely the point that you're making. The best we can do, if we are to find our way, is to approximate our way. And this is what maps do. So what would a perfect map be? The Argentine writer Borges had a short story about this. He had a short story about the perfect map of Argentina. The perfect map of Argentina would be Argentina again, a second Argentina. But this would be totally useless because it would not fit into your backpack or onto your bicycle or onto your bookshelf or whatnot. You see. So his perfect map of Argentina is just left out in the desert to rot away and be eaten by wild animals or something like that. And he's perfectly right. This is why the question of utility is related to the question of approximation. We approximate for some purpose because we are using history or we are using the map to find our way in some way. Maybe we're trying to find our way through the past. Maybe we're just trying to find our way to the next pizza parlor or whatever. But there's always this question of finding our way and approximating reality as a way of doing this. Seems to me.
Thank you very much. So before I turn it over to Professor Martynov, I just wanted to say, when I asked our guests to raise their hands, I meant the function in the Zoom. the raise hand function. Unfortunately, I cannot see everyone at once, and therefore if you click on the participant icon, you can see on your screen those blue hands raised. That is very easily recognizable. So if you could please just raise your hand as using this raise hand function, it would be excellent. And we have some 30 more minutes to go. And now Professor Martynov, who is chair of Russian Foreign Policy Studies at MGIMO.
Thank you, Mikhail. Well, dear professor, my question will be in a zoom out style.
Okay.
So, in your book, well known for all of us, The Cold War, you said that the Cold War could have been worse, much worse. Well, I wonder, was it due, on your opinion, was it due entirely that it did not turn so bad as it really turned out? Was it, on your point of view, a result of human efforts, or was it due to some other forces which we still don't know, and I suspect that we will never know, because for the last time we have been speaking, and we have been speaking just a lot about such a thing as a synergy of chaos. Of chaos. It's very interesting. And my question is, until what measure, on your point of view, should we take it into account in judging about the past, in our judging about the past, or in our trying to focus the future? Because as it seems, we cannot still more count only on our forces, on our reason, and on our proper human forecasts. Thank you very much.
Well, the question of how the Cold War could have been worse and how the worst was avoided in the Cold War, I think is a fascinating one. And I think we still don't have enough on this. And maybe it's because it's one of these issues that probably goes beyond the archives. It probably requires stepping back and trying to find a pattern, which would not necessarily be documented. It's the history of what did not happen. And that's a peculiar kind of history to write. But the pattern is simply this. Here were these two great antagonists, both of whom fairly quickly had developed the capacity to wipe each other out. And they chose not to use it. And nobody negotiated that. The non-use taboo was in effect really in the mid-1950s and from then on, and it played a big effect in the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. And nothing was written down about it, but it was found to be mutually convenient. It just made sense. And then something like that happened with reconnaissance satellites when they were developed, because of course, as we know, Khrushchev ordered the U-2 to be shot down in May of 1960. But when the first American reconnaissance satellite went up shortly thereafter, he did not make an effort to shoot that down. And nobody has ever since. Reconnaissance satellites were found to be useful by both sides. And so I think it's possible for antagonists at the same time to develop common interests. And I like to think about it in terms of an extremely competitive football match between two teams that just hate each other. And so they're trying to do maximum mayhem to each other on the playing field, for sure. But at the same time, they have an unstated agreement that in trying to destroy each other on the playing field, they will not try to destroy the spectators or the stadium or the parking lot. And so, and I think something like that is what happened in the Cold War. There can be competition within cooperation. This is an area where I learned something from political scientists. Bob Axelrod's work on the evolution of cooperation was very influential in pushing me in this direction. So that's my sense of
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you. And Ekaterina Koldunova is next. Dr. Koldunova is a student of Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. She lectures on leadership in Asia, leadership and politics in Asia.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is the sound okay?
Fine.
First of all, Professor Gaddis, thanks for talking to us today. And the title of the seminar, as we got it, is The Uses of History. So we all acknowledge that the history is important in terms of shaping students' perceptions and people's perceptions. We all agree that the history is important about tracing one's place in this world, country's place, humans' place, social groups' place, etc. But there might be different uses of history. And I'm talking about the politics of memory, about even the politics of history.
Sure.
So my question is, what can and really can historians do something about the use of history as the instrument of politics? Thank you.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on who the leaders are. And some leaders, as we know, are more receptive to reading historians than being influenced by historians than others. Some leaders read no history, whatever. Some leaders only send angry tweets, but of course I will name no names in that regard. Well, let me give you an example of a leader who actually was reading history and took it fairly seriously. And this is George W. Bush after the invasion of Iraq. And it just so happened that I had published my book on 9/11, Surprise Security in the American Experience, that came out. And I got a message from Condi Rice, who was National Security Advisor, that your book has been read at the White House, John, and would you come down and talk to my staff about it? You know, so I said, sure, Condi. I'd known Condi for a long time, and I came down and had lunch, and then she said after lunch, could you spare a moment or two for the president? And I said, yes, I thought I could, Condi. And so it was taken into the Oval Office, and there was George W. and there was Cheney and Condi. And George W. Bush had a copy of my book, and he said, sit down. And I noticed that the copy of the book had notes scribbled in it all over the place. You know, he actually had read it. He said, sit down. He said, tell me about Bismarck. And of course, I had not expected to have to give a lecture to the President of the United States about Bismarck just on the cuff like this, you know, but I did the best I could. And he said, that's really interesting. I said, one of the things that Bismarck understood were the advantages of shock and awe, but also knowing when to stop shocking and awing. And he said, that's very interesting. And then it turned out later, Condi, in writing her memoir, and Peter Baker, in writing his account of the Bush administration, say that that one simple idea had a significant influence on the administration. And you can read about this in their book. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but they claim that it did. And sure enough, this led to a whole series of seminars with Bush on history, in which I was involved and other historians were involved. And they were held very quietly, but we would come in and talk to him about maybe Wilson or Lincoln or whatnot. This would all be held in the Oval Office. And he took history extremely seriously and still does, reads a lot of it. Now, what difference did it make? Condi Rice and Peter Baker say this one idea was important in influencing Bush's policy in the second term. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not sure we can ever know for sure. There are all these stories about how Kennedy was influenced by Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we don't know this for sure. This is what somebody speculated. There are a lot of things that could have influenced Kennedy. Kennedy read a lot of history as well. So I think that these things happen, and there are some people, some historians, or some politicians who reach high levels and are genuinely curious about the past. And it would be odd if the histories they have read have not influenced their perspective in some way. But apart from direct evidence from someone on the scene, it's going to be very hard ever to document this kind of thing. So I think I just have to leave it at that, with the added qualification that probably when a historian does influence a policymaker, it's more likely to be by accident than by design. And so I go back to George Kennan and all of the efforts that he made in his career to influence policy on, for example, NATO, which he was very much against, on nuclear weapons, which he was very much against, on environmental dangers and all of this. And he spent vast amounts of time trying to influence policy on these issues with almost no effect whatever. But things that he spent no time on, like, for example, the long telegram from Moscow in February of 1946, something he just dictated in a fit of rage at the State Department, had greater influence than any other single idea in shaping American grand strategy in the Cold War. So you just never know when you're going to hit a point of criticality, as I was saying, and the injection of a particular idea can have a profound effect.
Thank you. Let me just give the floor for a comment to a student at MGIMO who's long been asking to make a comment. Martin Ventosa.
Well, good afternoon, Professor John Gaddis. It's a pleasure to have you here and to listen to your very interesting comments. Here in MGIMO, me and my colleagues took a very interesting class with Professor Tatiana Alexeyevna Shaklena, Regional Subsystems, in which we had to read, amongst other authors, about Paul Pillar. Now, Paul Pillar has this very interesting idea that where he posits that America is the un-Belgian, whereas since America had its development in like a safe territory, protected from any invasion, was able to pursue manifest destiny without any problems, unlike its European partners, that had to develop under the constant threat of invasion, that America became an arrogant power. Do you think this phenomenon can explain the aggravation of Iran with the Operation Ajax and Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion? These arrogant attacks that created enemies, permanent enemies for America. Thank you.
Well, I would be the first to admit that, yes, of course, the Americans can be arrogant. And yes, of course, they benefited from free security by having basically their own continent and so on. But I am struck by the number of countries who did not have free security, who nonetheless were arrogant and oppressive and imperial. The history of imperialism chiefly originates in Europe, and Europe was a competitive cockpit. And imperialism was a way of carrying on the competition beyond Europe. So I don't see the Americans as the only ones who behaved in this manner. Indeed, I would flip the issue around and say it's pretty interesting that the Americans, who by the early 19th century had no competition of any substance in North America, they maybe had not explored it all or incorporated it all, but they were safe enough after about the 1820s to know that security was not going to be an issue for them. And you could argue that such a nation would immediately have jumped to the status of a world superpower. But the Americans did not jump at that point. They confined themselves to being a regional power. And this, of course, was hard on the Native Americans. It was hard on Mexico, which lost half of its territory. But we did not really acquire overseas colonies until 1898, really. So we went for a long time without becoming a world power. And indeed, one of the really interesting questions for the whole period of the last 3/4 of the 19th century is why the United States, with such potential, did not choose to become a world power at that point. And I don't think enough has been written about that. I think it's a fascinating case. It's, again, something that did not happen. But much of the preoccupation of the Western democracies in Europe in the 20th century, the British and the French particularly, had to do with how we can get the Americans to exercise their power, to realize their power, and to come and help us and bail us out against Germany. And the fear was not of American arrogance, but the fear was of American isolation right up until the outbreak of World War II.
Okay, thank you very much. And I suggest we have a little bit less than 20 minutes to go. So let me suggest we take the remaining questions in groups of 2, if I may. So Igor Istomin, a theorist of IR, MGIMO's leading theorist, is next.
Thank you so much. I hope you could hear me. Thank you so much, Mikhail, for such a flattering representation. I just wanted to come back, if possible, to some of your previous comments and discussions that you had. Also, I really liked what you said about hedgehogs and foxes. And I have to say that the Deadlocks books is the one that with which I start usually this semester with my students and talking about this distinction. And of course, I have to admit the original sin that I'm a political scientist by training. So I am thinking also in terms of various kinds of variables and but this brings me to the question that to what extent we could draw this difference between history and social science in terms of this distinction between hedgehogs and foxes. Don't you think that as soon as we become hedgehogs, we cease to be scholars in the first place? And it's regardless whether we are political scientists or historians. Because, you know, Bruno Latour, a very famous French specialist who was studying primarily hard sciences, he used to say that as soon as truth emerges, science disappears, because science scholarship is always about doubt, about questioning your premises. And this is true regardless whether we try to draw some generalization and to zoom out, or we try to look at the specifics in the zooming in. So I just wanted to ask to what extent you could agree with that this is something that unites us, various strands of science.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Why don't we let Professor Gaddis respond to that right away? And I think we will have time for a couple of 3 more questions.
Well, sure. I don't. That is the ideal, it seems to me, is that political scientists and historians should be able to cooperate with each other. I think doubt, skepticism should be the attitude that all of us have toward conventional wisdom, toward whatever the prevailing view is. And we should be focusing on what new insights we can bring to bear that refine our picture of the past, even if in some cases it upsets our picture of the past. But it does seem to me that there comes a point at which we speak different languages. And I see it particularly in trying to supervise graduate students here at Yale who are working in political science, but have used historical sources, historical archives. And what I see, unfortunately, is the effort still to try to find this elusive independent variable and to construct case studies that will allow it to reveal itself. But the case studies are themselves constructions. They are isolations of history from the stream of history. they are picked out and exhibited in a kind of a museum case or something like that. But there's very little sense of evolution among the political scientists that I know. I think it's because they are trying to imitate what they believe are the hard sciences. And that would be characteristic of some hard sciences, but not all. And this is why I've tried to make the point that hard sciences like paleontology or evolutionary biology, geology, astronomy, these are historical sciences. One of my students years ago, one of my undergraduate students, once capped it all when he said that we should not be worrying about whether history is a science or not. We should be worried, we should be dealing with which sciences are historical. And from that point of view, it seems to me about half of the so-called sciences are in one way or another historical. And I would wish that our social science colleagues would more readily acknowledge that.
Okay, thank you. And we have Tatiana Shakleina, Ekaterina Romanova, and Vladimir Degoev. So Professor Shakleina is next, and she's chair of Applied International Analysis at MGIMO, and of course, one of the keenest observers of the United States foreign policy in Russia.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Gaddis, for coming and giving impulse to this very interesting discussion. Since we don't have much time, I just wanted to say that I am very much impressed that you started to read War and Peace. I think it's very wise of you. It may give the sense of Russia for American students. I'm going a different way. And now I come back to publications by Soviet and American scholars in history and political science of the 70s and 80s and the beginning of 90s. So there were a lot of ideas, very important and very interesting to remember now when we analyze Russian-American relations. So my question is simple and maybe direct. Since I teach contemporary international relations, American foreign policy, and Russian-American relations, how can you analyze and define, define the present state of bilateral relations? Some people say it is new Cold War. Some people say it is strange Cold War. Some people even deny that it is anything like Cold War. So what do you suggest? Sometimes, and do you think it is already a kind of a non-variable thing in bilateral relations, something like a paradigm, and will never go away from this kind of relations, having this pattern of Cold War or any kind of war? Thank you.
Well, I think it's definitely a Cold War, but I would say it's a Cold War in small case letters, not in capital letters. The Cold War with capitals, capital C, capital W, I think was a very distinct period in history. It had an ideological dimension to it, which the present situation does not really have. It had a nuclear weapons dimension to it as a critical variable, which is much less evident now. It was bipolar, and the present system is certainly tending toward multipolarity rather than bipolarity. But there have always been periods of tension in international relations going back to the very founding of the international state system 500 years ago, not all of which developed into hot wars. And it seems to me what we face now is something like that. I think there is an emerging pattern in this. I think it probably has to do, if I would just put this in the briefest possible terms, it probably has to do with the Americans squandering the opportunities that they created for themselves 30 years ago by winning the Cold War. It's a matter of the Americans not having quite known what to do with their victory. And I think having dissipated many of its benefits through their own selfishness, through their own short-term thinking, through their own distractions, and inattention to the interests of other countries, Russia being one, for sure, no doubt. So I think when the history of this is written, it's a history that will not be particularly flattering to the conduct of American foreign policy post 1991. And that comes right down to the present day. And I think it will be the task of historians to figure out why the United States did as well as it did in the Cold War with capital letters. It was a cacophonous democracy then, and it's a cacophonous democracy now, but with very, very different outcomes on the world scene, it seems to me. And that's going to be the task for the new generation of historians, it seems to me, who will write this history. And I hope it's written on both sides. I hope it's written by Russians. I hope it's written by Chinese, but it will also be written by, of course, Americans as well. And it won't be any good unless it is critical, unless it is honest, unless it takes into account all of the available sources, and unless it takes into account the characteristics of a stable international system, which really have to do with each partner within the system feeling that the system benefits it and is not exploiting it. And that's what's missing right now in the current situation, it seems to me.
Thank you very much. So Ekaterina Romanova is next, and Professor Romanova is the principal lecturer in world history at the English medium International Affairs School at MGIMO, but she comes from the Moscow University, Moscow Lomonosov University. So of course,
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and Professor Gaddis, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And speaking about zooming in and zooming out in history, being myself a historian of the international relations of the early 20th century, I think I got myself the most vivid idea of what the First World War was, not from the diplomatic documents of the idea, which I could not get from the diplomatic documents, but from Alban Berg's Opera Wozzeck. It showed me what it did for a person. And so I totally agree with you that it's very important to look at our past from different levels to understand its complexity. But my question is about France.
If I could, I would just add that I totally agree with that, because I am married to an opera director. Tony teaches theater here, but she has also become a director of operas, and she loves doing that. And I have learned a lot from her about that as well. So
yeah. Sometimes actually I'm thinking of also involving, well, the history of music into history classes, because I think, yeah, that it shows that what other documents can't show. But my question is about grand strategy.
Yes.
As the art which addresses the problem of the alignment of unlimited ends with limited means.
Yes.
And I sometimes have a feeling that this idea of unlimited ends is the idea of the age of ideologies, of the 19th century, of the 20th century. And sometimes I think that probably the problem is not the alignment of just unlimited ends and limited means, but that we think of the ends as unlimited. And what does it say us about setting the ends, about the essence of the ends, about the directions in which we have to look for the ends? I think that's the important question as well. Thank you.
Well, I think that there's a lot that makes sense in what you say. And I think ideology is fascinating to think about in this case. I do think that ideology leads to unlimited, or leads to the illusion of unlimited aspirations. The thing that has always impressed me about the great ideologies is what happens when you win. So say the world goes communist, or say the world goes capitalist, and your ideology has triumphed. Then what? Say you're Napoleon, who himself had an ideology. He was his own ideology, really. Say you're Napoleon, and you capture Moscow. Then what? What happens next? So that's always the question, it seems to me, that does not get asked when you have some totalizing ideology. The end of the process, what does envisage? What is a classless society in the first place? You know? What is a triumph of markets in the first place? All of these things. You know? This never really gets asked. And this is one of the reasons why at one level I'm inclined profoundly to distrust ideologies. At the same time, I've had to acknowledge from the documents that began to open up in the 80s and 90s how profoundly important ideology was, Marxism-Leninism was, both to the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China in that period. But it seems to me always the question that should have been asked is, okay, if you win, then what? And I think that's why the American foreign policy has had such a bad record since. We had an ideology of our own, or at least if you can trust Professor Fukuyama, we did. And it's very interesting that Fukuyama entitled his famous article, "The End of History," that he published in 1989. And of course, history did not end in 1989. But at the same time, Fukuyama did not ask in 1989, then what? What comes next?
Thank you. And last but not least is Professor Vladimir Degoev, who is a leading historian of diplomacy at MGIMO. And actually, some 15 years ago, he published a book that I, at the time, considered a response to Kissinger's diplomacy. I guess the book was titled Russia and the International System, and it was a stereoscopic view of Russia's diplomacy over several centuries, basically beginning from Ivan the Terrible. So I'm still an admirer of that book. And Vladimir Degoev, the floor is yours to conclude this session.
Thank you very much for a generous presentation. Professor Gaddis, I would like to bring you back to 1997 when you published a book that made you famous. In the preface, you said that Professor Halley's Cold War as history was premature because in 1967 it was too early to turn Cold War into a historical subject.
Yes.
I absolutely agree with you. And still, don't you think that a book with the same name, or almost the same name, was premature even in 1997? After all, at that time, only 6 years, which is too few, had elapsed since the demise of the Soviet Union. Even nowadays, we know about Cold War much less than we would like to know.
Yeah.
There is little or no hope that a full picture will be available for a historian ever, because in some aspects, Cold War is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, to paraphrase Mr. Churchill. It is not at all to dispute the fact that you wrote a great book, let alone what preceded it, in, I mean, a number of articles and the monograph on the long peace in Europe, which is absolutely fascinating. Nevertheless, it seems to me that writing books about Cold War will always remain a risky even if very exciting pursuit. In other words, a blind reliance on the lessons of history could be futile and even dangerous. And this will not sound too strange if we consider that each new situation in history is unique and requires appropriate attitude.
Mhm.
History is not able to give us right answers to modern challenges simply because it doesn't know them. The wind shifts or the crosswinds of history, let me put it this way, are absolutely unpredictable. And it imposes a huge responsibility on the powers that be and on those who take crucial global decisions. So, to make it short, how do you feel about all that? Thank you.
Well, I would say two things about that. First of all, that book title got me into a lot of trouble for a lot of different reasons. But I would emphasize that word now, the middle word in that title. And I tried to say, I think, in the preface to the book, this is, now is 1997.
Deconstruction.
We know a lot more than,
Yeah,
we know a lot more than we knew in 1967 when Professor Halle published that book. But at the same time, I was trying to be careful to say that we will know more as time goes on. And indeed, that is the case. We have learned a lot of new things now. So from where I'm sitting, I can look across the street in New Haven to the house of Professor Odd Arne Wested, who has just moved to Yale from Harvard and has written a wonderful book on the Cold War, which updates what I said in my book, for sure. So I did not expect that it would be a definitive work. I saw it as a kind of provisional report on what the sources were showing. Looking back on it, in terms of the big picture, there's not a great deal that I would change. I think mostly it was correct. It's obviously wrong on details and obviously neglectful, as Arne Wested would say, for sure, of some critical issues, particularly third world issues. But it never was meant as anything other than a provisional report. So then back to the larger question of what it is that historians are trying to do and what it is that their students should learn from historians. And I try to find things that relate to the student's own daily experience. So I find that it's very helpful to compare the teaching of history to the coaching of athletics, because they all know about athletics and they go out every afternoon and run around and practice, and they have coaches who have mastered the history and the legends of the game and who seek to instruct them in how the game is to be played. But when the students get out on the playing field and they're meeting the other team, or they're floundering in mud, or the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, or whatever is happening, they don't have a home court advantage. They have to make instant decisions right there on the spot. They cannot freeze the game, call the coach and say, "Coach, what do I do?" They have to make their own decisions, you see, at this point. But does anybody think that they will make those decisions more wisely if they didn't have a coach, if they were never coached in the first place? Well, of course not. So the coach prepares you for uncertainty, but the coach does not tell you exactly how to act in a particular crisis situation. And this gets back to what Tolstoy knew in talking about the art of military command. It gets back to what Clausewitz knew, Clausewitz having this wonderful passage in On War, which I quote, "Let us accompany a novice to the battlefield." And the implication is the novice will be better equipped for the battlefield if he's undergone drill, if he's undergone training. But at the same time, in the end, the novice has to respond, make his own decisions. And it seems to me something like that is what teachers of history can do. They can never anticipate all the things that are going to confront our students after they leave our classrooms. And our students will be on their own. We have to turn them loose. But at the same time, we can take a certain satisfaction, I think, if we have coached them well. And that's the way I like to look at history, not as something for which, as you correctly say, there is an objective answer, but for as an effort to do the best we can to train a future generation for unpredictable things. That's the way I would put it.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating 90 minutes, so rich in insights, and it will take us plenty of time to digest. So the recording of this session will be available, and we'll be sure to circulate the link. And again, let me thank you, Professor Gaddis, on behalf of MGIMO and Vice Rector Bykov and everyone for your time and your great contribution. And we hope we'll get the chance to be in touch again sometime in the future. So this ends our session. Thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone who wanted has had the chance to speak. And yeah, goodbye.
Thank you, all of you. Wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.